Good afternoon, ladies and gents. It's the 14th of August, 2024. I've had a couple of weeks off with this content. Just wanted to get it together, I don't know, a couple of other sort of sessions just to add to these first 15 videos that I've kind of created as it's like a foundation, or let's say me just laying the landscape for the prepping arena. So for anybody who's new to it, or is kind of just getting started, or just wants some further education or whatever it is, I've created those first 15 videos really just to give people an idea of what it's about and what we should be worried about, and how to prepare and all the rest of it. Okay, it's a complete overview, but I'm going to recommend, though, if you're going to have time to watch those videos, I would watch them in order. That meaning start at video 1, work your way through to video 15. If you don't watch them in order, you might get confused with what's being said. So when I've created those, they've been created logically and in a logical order. And the reason for that is just so we can lay the ground and the landscape out, layer by layer. So it's just a logical order. Again, I'm just going to throw up some slides. Whether that's prevents you from falling asleep or not, I don't know, but it's just better than looking at what's on the screen at the moment. It's going to be, and it's not an interactive video. It's a session. We're going to have a discussion, and we're going to be talking about normality or normalcy bias. So with that, let's get moving. Normalcy bias or normality bias is a cognitive bias which leads people to disbelieve or minimize threat warnings. Consequently, individuals underestimate the likelihood of a disaster when it might affect them and its potential adverse effects. The normalcy bias causes many people to prepare inadequately for things like natural disasters, market crashes, and calamities caused by human error. About 80% of people reportedly display normalcy bias during a disaster. So that is a statistic close to the 85% of people that fall into the category of sheep. Now, if you're not familiar with that, on my very first video, introduction to the channel, we talk about those two categories of people, that being a sheep and a shepherd. We won't go into that now, but it's worth watching just so you understand. Just quickly, actually, before we go on, the reason for this normality bias and my focus on this is I want to emphasize the threats, and that doesn't mean missiles and bombs, artillery and tanks and soldiers and stuff like that. You have to look, especially when we live in a country where we're not experiencing that conflict at the moment, there are still threats. Some of those threats, or a lot of those threats, are closer than you think. And what I mean by that is that, the very people around you, your next door neighbors, the people you work with, and those sorts of people can quickly become a threat if the shit hits the fan. But the closest threat to home is going to be with yourselves. I won't go into it right now. We're going to explain it in a minute. But normality bias is a threat to you and to the people that you're responsible for. So I just think it's important that if we're talking about threats, because we're talking about preparing, so we need to prepare for the threats. Otherwise, there's no point in this discussion or the channel or any other prepping channels and sessions that are out there. But for you to sort of understand those threats, certainly, and this can be kind of quite complex, and it can, contradictory to some people when you start saying, well, there's this person's a sheep and that person's a shepherd. Some people actually take offense to that, and I don't know why. They probably envisage themselves looking like a sheep as opposed to the reason why it's actually being suggested in the first place. Again, let's not get into that. But what I'm trying to say is just understanding the people around you, their emotions, and why they do things. Let me give you an example. Why people don't prepare, and then when the shit hits the fan, they all go off to the supermarket buying shitloads of toilet paper. Okay, in a SHTF situation that could involve conflict to this country, would force people to be panic buying. And it wouldn't be just for toilet paper, it'd be for food and water and all sorts of other stuff. So what I'm trying to say is, if you have got those people doing that, then they are a threat to you, because you might want to go to the supermarket, pick up your bits and pieces, and all of a sudden all the shelves are empty. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that, the reason you might say, well, what's normalcy bias got to do with this? Well, normalcy bias is a threat. Okay. It's a threat to you. If you are not normalcy bias, that's good. But be aware that 80 to 90% of the population in your country will be. That's just the way it is. And the reason for that will be reasons that I'm going to explain now. Why is normalcy bias here? Why do we think, along those lines and all the rest of it? But listen, let me stop going off on a tangent. Let's just talk about this. So if you're normalcy bias, like I've just said there, just don't, there's nothing to worry about. It's like being a sheep or a shepherd. It doesn't matter. Okay. They're just, kind of, they're statements that are being made. We have all gone through sort of life getting used to the norm, and you know can't be getting used to sort of anything other than that, really, because if there's nothing happening outside of the norm, then how can you actually get used to it? Let me tell you, it's actually difficult to take this prepping business on board fully sometimes because of normalcy bias in itself. It gets in the way. It's got in the way with me, and it will get in the way of everyone else because you're trying to convince yourself that something possibly could happen. But you're having to put scenarios through your mind. So what you're doing is just imagining scenarios that haven't happened in your lifetime. And sometimes normalcy bias creeps in and says, well, is this actually likely to happen? I've got to be careful when I use those two words, or the word likely. I want to change that word likely to possibly. Okay, likely and possibly, very different. Okay, but either or, I think that these things are likely to happen, but I'd rather say to you guys it's a possibility. It's very difficult to imagine and see something that isn't, on your doorstep, shall we say. So to help me through this journey, certainly over the last couple of years, I've made it my duty to track the Ukraine war for the last 905 days daily. And with that, you automatically get sucked into other potential conflicts around the world. The main concern here is that there are sort of major conflicts unfolding across three different regions, or three major fronts, let's call it that, because they are major fronts, that being Europe. So the Ukraine war could easily, and probably will, no doubt, overspill into European countries, and then full-blown war is between Russia and NATO. That's on the cards. That's on its way, and it's not too far down the road. Possibility or speculation, whatever you want to call it. Middle East, that's about to pop off. And of course, then you've got Asia. But the concern that I have is that they look like they could all pop off at the same time. So we're not talking about one major issue, we're talking about three, and that's where your world war comes into play. Okay, the whole world at war. Don't want to go down that road. We're talking about normalcy bias, so let's crack on. So normalcy bias has also been called analysis paralysis, or the ostrich effect. I think by first responders or the emergency services and stuff like that, the negative panic, I think that's what they call it. The opposite to normalcy bias is overreaction, or worst case scenario bias, which, it's basically small deviations from normality. I've dealt with as signals of impending catastrophe. So what does that all mean, and why do we believe that nothing bad is going to happen? The normalcy bias describes our tendency to underestimate the possibility of disaster and then believe that life will just continue as normal, even in the face of significant threats or crises. I'm going to read an example to you, and some sort of information I've picked up online somewhere. I've pulled this session together based on other people's expertise and professional quotes and things like that. I'm not a specialist or professional in this arena, but I see normalcy or normality bias as a direct threat, and as a prepper, we have to be aware of all threats. So consider the following hypothetical scenario. There's a woman called Emma. She's a meticulous planner. She lives in a region prone to occasional earthquakes. And despite the area's sort of history of activity, Emma has never experienced a major earthquake in her life. Consequently, she disregards the importance of preparing an emergency kit or formulating any kind of evacuation plan. Firmly, she's convinced that her day-to-day life will remain unaltered. So those things, happen to other people and not me. So she continues to sort of tell herself that those little quotes, and that's part of the normality bias trait, should we say. You're trying to convince yourself that nothing's going to happen. One day, however, as Emma sort of goes out doing her usual sort of routine or whatever it is, she feels a subtle tremor beneath her feet. Instead of immediately recognizing the potential danger and taking precautionary measures, she brushes off the sensation, attributing it to a passing construction truck or some other mundane case. Within seconds, the light tremor turns into a strong shaking, and Emma finds herself stuck inside her apartment during a major earthquake. As this example shows, the normalcy bias occurs when individuals sort of encounter potential threats, but instinctively downplay their significance. Emma's confidence in the predictability of her daily routine prevented her from acknowledging the risk of a major earthquake and the need to prepare accordingly. This cognitive bias is not just confined to sort of natural disasters. It permeates various sort of aspects of life, affecting, I don't know, our ability to recognize and respond effectively to impending challenges, such as, I don't know, financial uncertainties and health crises. So the individual effects with the normalcy bias, when left unchecked, can be profound. It can present sort of profound implications on individual decision making and sort of personal outcomes. People often reject sort of signals of potential disruptions due to their subconscious reliance on the assumption that life is just going to be fine. For instance, someone might disregard the early signs of a developing health issue and fail to seek immediate sort of medical assistance, help, or advice, and instead just convincing themselves that the problem isn't that serious and will just probably go away or disappear. Similarly, in the realm of personal finance, a tendency to remain optimistic and believe that, I don't know, everything will continue to function as normal can lead you to make poor investment choices. Imagine for a moment that you have stocks in a company that has been sort of struggling and the share prices begin to sort of fall. Driven by their confidence that the shares will quickly recover and return to then sort of normal or regular performance, you decide not to take any action. However, if the price continues to plummet and you hold on to that investment, your inability to heed the early warning signs may result in, significant or catastrophic losses. I mean, losses financially, that is. The systemic effects can be sort of, it's kind of when the normalcy bias also sort of impacts broader social structures, affecting how institutions respond to impending challenges. Take, for instance, a city's emergency management system. When decision sort of makers underestimated the likelihood of a potential impact of a natural disaster, their response and resource allocation may sort of fall short when a disaster or any disaster actually does sort of strike. This is actually what happened in February 2021 when the winter storm Uri, that's spelled URI, slammed into the city of Austin in Texas. The city's authorities never anticipated or planned for a severe winter sort of storm on that scale. And as a result, their emergency services were less than effective and sort of disorganized. So they were all over the place. They oversaw this. They knew it was kind of coming, but not on this scale. Another area where we can see the potential effects of normalcy bias is in cybersecurity. Have you ever let your antivirus expire or not renewed it? Or let's say accepted the updated privacy policy on your favorite social media app without even reading through it? It's sometimes difficult to take seriously the dozens of digital sort of advisories that we receive every day. Everyone gets them. If you're online, on your phone, your laptop, even at work, especially if that negative sort of events, those not events, but those, and it's not negative. What they are, they're warnings or notifications, but they come across as negative. If it's on a personal level and you've got to update something, or you've got to commit to a purchase or something like that, there's a tendency to just skip through it. Our tendency is, in many cases, to be honest with you, is to ignore it. Actually, you actually do. You kind of ignore those potential threats, which also stems from our desire for security, routine, and sort of certainty in our lives. So when the repetitive and the sort of predictability or the predictable sort of nature of our everyday existence is disrupted, or our usual sort of surroundings abruptly change, we can feel, or some people can feel anxious and unsettled. From this perspective, the normalcy bias acts as a coping mechanism that sort of helps us deal with the uncertainty, and it should, or probably does for them, sort of reduce their stress levels. However, to fully understand why the normalcy bias happens, we also need to sort of look at the influence of other cognitive mechanisms and biases on our, perception of reality and the ability to make decisions. Right. Many always think positively. Okay. The normalcy bias is closely linked to the optimism bias. Our tendency to overestimate our likelihood of experiencing positive events and underestimating the likelihood or our likelihood of experiencing negative events. Let's consider a scenario where an individual is facing a looming deadline at work while experiencing symptoms of burnout. Despite feeling sort of overwhelmed and exhausted, they convince themselves that the task will get done on time and that they can maintain their usual sort of work routine. By fixating on a positive outcome of the situation, the individual underestimates the potential impact of burnout on their sort of performance and fails to take the appropriate action. We then have the attachment to current beliefs. Beliefs are our brain's way of making sense of our complex world, and they help us with decision making. We tend to believe information that is consistent with our existing beliefs, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. So again, sorry guys, there's another bias here. We're not talking about that in this session, but we'll just mention what it is. But when faced with potential threats, we may be presented with information that goes against our existing beliefs. If we revisit the example of blockbusters, if for any of you guys are new blockbusters, if you're as old as me, the video rental or DVD rental store, we can see how, the company back in those days ignored, sorry, the threat of mail order DVDs because they had an unwavering sort of attachment to their existing belief that browsing in a store was still the most popular way to rent movies. By staying committed to their sort of current beliefs, they ended up dismissing information about potential negative events, which feels, unfamiliar and counterintuitive. So basically what happens is they believed no matter what that their way of doing things would get them through whatever times, and that actually wasn't the case. As to thinking positively. How about following the crowd? When making decisions on how to act during a complex or unfamiliar situation, we take cues from our environment and what everyone else is doing around us. Sheep, as I pointed out earlier and in a couple of my other videos, but in a study by a sociologist, somebody called Torres Drebeck, he found that when told to evacuate before a potential hurricane or flood, residents checked the severity of the situation with 4 or more other sources, such as family, neighbours, and newscasters, before taking action. The principle of social proof is a mental shortcut that we use to sort of help us process large amounts of sort of news and data, that kind of stuff, and make decisions on how to act. If everyone around us is, I don't know, downplaying the risks of the potential threat and hesitating to take action, we're more likely to follow their example. Cognitive dissonance or dissonance reduction is one fundamental reason for this normalcy bias lies in our instinctual desire to avoid cognitive dissonance. When faced with conflicting beliefs, such as the belief in a stable, predictable world versus I don't know, the recognition of a potential threat, our minds strive to alleviate the discomfort arising from this dissonance. Research indicates that individuals often resort to downplaying the severity of potential risks in order to maintain internal consistency. In the case of the normalcy bias, this manifests as a tendency to perceive threats probably less severe than they might actually be, aligning our beliefs with a more sort of comforting narrative. We then have, you've probably heard of this term, and it's the crying wolf. Most of us have heard of this. I think the term is actually to cry wolf. The saying originates from the fable about the shepherd boy who repeatedly sort of fooled villagers into thinking that a wolf was about to attack their sheep. When a wolf actually came to the village, no one listened to the boy's warning because they believed it was another false alarm. In today's information saturated society, we are continuously sort of advised about potential threats in our daily lives, even when the risks of they're often sort of minimal. Maybe we were told to take a look at the safety card on a plane. Now we've all been there. I know that. Or read the sign on the I don't know, the what's it, exoneration form for a sports event that we're taking part in. Most of the time, we don't even read these through carefully. This is like terms and conditions and things like that. I mean, how many of us read terms and conditions? We're all clicking and agreeing to things online without reading the terms and conditions. It could be signing our lives away. They're not doing it on purposely. They're just doing it for legal reasons. But we, as a race, society, or whatever it is, we actually just don't have time for it. we take it as gospel that we've got our backs covered, when in fact they're only covering their own backs. But in essence, the normalcy bias is a complex interplay of different cognitive processes. So I've named sort of 3 or 4 during this session so far, but they're all aimed at reducing internal conflicts, maintaining satisfaction with the status quo, and grappling with the perceived challenges of change. So recognizing these underlying mechanisms is pivotal in overcoming the initial sort of association or the associated normalcy bias of fostering a more sort of adaptive mindset in the face of uncertainty. And why is it important? In movies, we have characters often react swiftly to disasters. You'll see them displaying quick decision making and heroic responses in order to sort of keep us glued to those seats, though. The cinematic portrayals sort of tend to exaggerate and dramatize those immediacy and reactions in crisis. So this can create a kind of a perception that real life responses should sort of mirror the rapid and decisive actions seen on screen. In reality, though, our sort of response to threats and catastrophes couldn't be any further from that you see on TV. The complexity and variability of human behavior during a crisis has fascinated researchers for decades, with studies concluding that people are actually more likely to sort of remain calm and deliberate in an emergency. During 9/11, for example, the average wait time among survivors to evacuate the towers was 6 minutes, with some people waiting up to half an hour to leave. Around 1,000 people even took time to shut down the computers and complete other office activities, a strategy to continue engaging in normal activities during an unknown situation. So although there was a crisis, they didn't know what was coming. The normalcy bias affects our decision making in a variety of sort of scenarios. It can influence us whether we have a long time to prepare or a short time to react. And it can impact situations on both a small and large scale. At an individual level, though, the normalcy bias can lead to delayed sort of responses and poor decision making, resulting in adverse sort of effects in our personal lives. A systemic level, minimizing potential risks and failing to plan for catastrophes can have, far-reaching consequences when large groups of people are involved. Above all these, the influence of the normalcy bias on people's decision making can have dangerous, even life-threatening implications during a disaster or crisis, which is what I've already sort of pointed out. We are talking about people's reactions, people's emotions, and how they perceive, things to happen, or how they actually deal with that situation when it's happening. Ignoring the signs of the potential catastrophe until it's sort of on your doorstep not only puts your own sort of lives in danger, which is all, I've already mentioned it again, but it does put the lives of those around you in danger as well, whether that's people within close proximity of you in the same building or room, or the people you're responsible for, like your kids and your family. So how to avoid it? That is normalcy bias. First and foremost, I would, and I'm not trying to encourage you to read these, but I am, not read these, listen to these, but I am, because first and foremost, you need to understand what it is. Secondly, you need to acknowledge that you could be normalcy biased. And guys, is, like I say, most of us are, most of us have been, most of us will continue to be. But it's just about how, it's dangerous, okay, and it's just sometimes you need to pull your heads out of your asses and kind of wake up to what's going on. But with the normalcy bias, we're going to try to evade the stark realization that terrible events can happen to us, not just to other people. As hard as it may be, avoiding the normalcy bias starts with acknowledging the terrible events that can happen to us and to anyone else around us. Okay, so it's just accepting the fact that the danger's there. Possible, not likely. This can be difficult to do because planning for potential disasters goes against our desire to be optimistic about the future and to feel safe within the immediate environment. Educating ourselves about potential risks and threats may also make us feel unnecessarily worried and sort of anxious. I was going to say anxiety, but it's the same thing. Anxious, paranoid, and things like that. They're feelings that people aren't comfortable with. However, you have to think about certain situations, and you will find actually that the more you think about these, the more you prepare for these, the more you kind of get your head around what's going on, the less worried you are going to be, the less anxious and the less paranoid you'll find yourself. So according to a professor at Duke University, one of the most challenging behavioral biases we need to sort of overcome is how narrowly we think about the future. In other words, overcoming our tendency to only plan for one forecast scenario or outcome. When we relate this to the normalcy bias, this describes our failures to think ahead of the potential negative events and the threats, preferring instead to focus on what normally happens. So to tackle this limited outlook, the author suggests 4 different strategies to sort of broaden our perspective. I'm just going to go through these, a couple of these quickly. Make 3 estimates or forecasts for the future. When predicting the potential outcome, make a low, medium, and high estimate. So on top of that, you'll need to also try and forecast twice. And what I mean by that is after making sort of one forecast, assume that it was wrong and you then predict again. When we think twice about a problem, we usually look at it from a different perspective the second time around. Make the pre-mortem. Humans are really good at sort of revisiting and dissecting past negative events to try and sort of understand the cause. Whilst post-mortems look backwards, pre-mortems imagine potential disasters and explore their likely causes. So this is stuff that's likely to happen. Secondly, take an outsider's view. When you've made a decision about something, take a moment to, I don't know, consider what somebody else outside might be thinking about. Put yourself into somebody else's shoes, really. Think back to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic when everyone was panic buying toilet roll and other essential items. Overnight, people who usually just bought what they needed for the week ahead became preppers or survivalists, or whatever you want to call them. The people who so proactively sort of prepared for potential emergencies such as natural disasters, wars, or global catastrophes. No one is suggesting, though, that you need to start stockpiling months worth of food and toilet roll for a disaster that might never happen. But engaging in a scenario sort of planning and preparedness measures, such as emergency kits or financial planning for uncertainties, can provide tangible steps to sort of, I suppose, navigate disruptions more effectively. Now, for me, as the world is taking a severe turn of events, I'm not going to go on about it. I'm not going to talk about what you should and shouldn't be doing. Okay, this is a prepping channel, but we're talking about normalcy bias, and I don't want to go on a tangent. But instead of assuming that life will always adhere to routine, mentally explore various potential scenarios, both positive and negative. Develop contingency plans for unexpected events, and consider how you would react and adapt. This proactive approach not only sort of enhances your readiness and your foreseen challenges, but also it disrupts the complacency associated with that normalcy bias. So, right, so just quickly, not saying go off and get shitloads of kit and all the rest of it. This prepping starts at home. When I say starts at home, I don't mean the home that you live in. I mean at home in your own mind. You need to prepare yourself, you as a person. Forget about your food and your water and all the rest of it. This prepping starts with you. Okay, you as a person. If you've got normalcy bias in the way, that needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, you will not be able to prepare properly. Okay, so start with yourself. Start educating yourself. Start taking note of signs and signals. I'm going to call them signs and signals. There's a lot of bullshit out there. There's loads of misinformation. The governments are even talking a load of shit. But listen, they're talking a load of shit because they're masking that shit with something. You know what I mean? They're up. Listen, things are happening, and they're just going to downplay this stuff. I'm going to move on quickly. Okay. The unknown virus, I'm going to talk about quickly. So the normalcy bias recently manifested itself in early 2020 during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the virus began its global spread, there was a tendency among many to downplay the severity of the situation and just cling on to the belief that life would soon return to normal. I was guilty of that. It's not something I'd gone through before, and I was under the illusion that everything that wasn't going to last long. Okay, and I couldn't have been any more wrong. Faced with the daily warnings of the rising sort of death tolls, full-scale lockdowns, and the strict social restrictions, many people just refused to believe that the pandemic would last beyond a few months, let alone years. Driven by the desire to sort of get back to normal, people tried to continue with their, pre-pandemic routines, believing that they wouldn't be negatively impacted. The public's complacency around the virus was exacerbated by, I suppose, the fact that many people didn't sort of know anyone who had been seriously impacted by the illness, thus reducing their sort of perception of the threat. That's similar to, let's say, if you're somebody that's had cancer in the family, you've experienced that disease either, with a family member or something like that, then you're going to be well aware of what that situation feels like. If you never have, you'll go through life and you'll assume that it's never going to happen to you. In a study actually conducted across various European countries, researchers found that the pandemic developed people who didn't sort of know anyone who had had sort of COVID-19 became increasingly unrealistically optimistic about their chances of evading the virus in the first place. So in other words, despite clear warnings and signs around them, such as the exponentially rising cases and the hospitalization numbers, people continue to hold on to the belief that those high levels of infection only concerned other people. In many cases, the normalcy bias contributed to delayed and sometimes inadequate responses at both sort of individual and social levels, as people sort of struggled to accept the gravity of the unfolding crisis. Example number 2, the unsinkable ship, this is called. So the sinking of RMS Titanic in 1912 is a poignant illustration of the devastating impact of normalcy bias, and the impact that it can have on our sort of decision making in a time of crisis. So despite receiving several warnings, icebergs in the area from sort of nearby ships, the captain continued full speed, believing that the crew would sort of react in time if they saw the danger ahead. Before she set sail, many describe the Titanic as unsinkable due to her advanced technology and sheer size. Consequently, the ship's crew members sort of underestimated the potential impact of a collision because they believed that such a catastrophic event couldn't happen to a state-of-the-art ship on her maiden voyage. On top of this, new evidence actually has emerged in 2012, which showed that one of the Titanic's safety officers' name was Maurice Clark, warned the ship's company just hours before their departure that they should sail with more lifeboats. So the lifeboats that were on board weren't enough to cater for the amount of passengers. We already know that. In their eagerness, though, to leave on time, the ship's company ignored Clark's warnings and just set sail with only 20 lifeboats on board for 2,209 passengers. The company's dismissal of Clark's warning ultimately led to the death of many of the Titanic's passengers who were unable to evacuate the ship. So in summary, the normalcy bias describes our tendency to underestimate the possibility of a disaster, or any disaster, shall we say, and believe that life will just simply continue as normal, even in the face of significant threats and crises. But why does this happen? The normalcy bias is a complex interplay of different cognitive processes aimed at reducing internal conflicts, maintaining satisfaction within a status quo, and sort of grappling with the perceived challenges of change. In other words, it's a heuristic that it kind of helps us to make decisions and reduce stress during times of crises or impending disaster. It's difficult for us to process the implications of unimaginable events until we've actually experienced them. As humans, we tend to sort of base our actions on how often we see and experience things ourselves, rather than the likelihood of something actually happening. As such, we tend to believe that bad things won't happen to us and that our lives will just continue as normal, even if there's evidence to suggest otherwise. So guys, as I'm sort of mentioning these, I'm referring to what's happening today. These signs and signals are there, but people are choosing to ignore them. How do we avoid the normalcy bias? It's a good question. The first step to avoiding normalcy bias is making ourselves aware of it first and foremost, and then understanding how the bias affects our perception of reality and our ability to make decisions. So by acknowledging the fact that negative events can happen to us and not just to other people, we can start thinking sort of more broadly about the possible sort of future outcomes of that disaster or the events or whatever it is. This is achieved by overcoming our tendency to kind of only plan for one forecast scenario or routine, and considering the potential and negative events. While thinking about the worst sort of possible scenarios, it may feel sort of uncomfortable and go natural instincts for optimism. It can help us sort of make better decisions should we need to sort of act in an emergency. But I want to give you another example, guys, because this happened not too long ago, probably a month ago. What you're seeing here is a beach in Crimea, Ukraine. The normalcy bias would have been instilled into, I would say, the human race since day dot. And I've said in previous videos that whether you're normalcy or normality bias or not, It will be a matter of life and death if the shit hits the fan. And I'm just going to give you this brutal example. This is an example of normality bias. Last month, I think it was, Ukraine sent a missile into a target in Sevastopol, Crimea, which was intercepted, possibly. And when I say intercepted, intercepted by Russian defense. And parts of that missile, sort of after exploding in the air and being intercepted, killed and injured civilians whilst they were sunbathing on the beach. The Ukrainians have been bombing Sevastopol and Crimea now for months, probably much of this year, to be honest with you. So why are there people sunbathing on the beaches in a fucking war zone? Even when the bombs are dropping on your own town or in your area, as long as those shells aren't landing in the pockets, or in your pocket, should we say, or in your back gardens, then there's nothing to worry about. Now, I'm not sure whether this is stupidity, normality bias, or something else. But whatever it is, there are people out there suffering from it. If you are one of these people, then my suggestion would have to be, you've got to have a word with yourselves, guys. These civilians on these beaches were so normality bias, it got some of them eliminated and many more of them injured. Honestly, guys, the likelihood of bombs dropping on our streets, sort of here in the UK, I'll talk about the UK because that's where I am, is unlikely. But then, am I saying that because I'm being normality biased? I've never seen bombs dropping anywhere, let alone, here at home. So life, as I know it, is normal. Anything in a war and sort of conflict is possible. And if it's possible, then it's a threat. So I just wanted to get that across because I just cannot get my head round why there are people on the beach sunbathing in Sevastopol in Crimea. Is that? I mean, look at them. I just don't get it. I don't. That's a severe case of normality bias, if you ask me. I might have got that wrong, guys, but I mean, anyway, that's what I'm saying. There are far too many people out there suffering from this, and that's fine. To be accused of scaremongering is a defense mechanism. You have people out there saying that it is scaremongering. What the fuck do I know? Is what they'll be saying. Um, you know, they're not working for the government, the military, or intelligence. So how do they know that nothing's not going to happen or going to happen? If they were working in these places, then they wouldn't be saying that, they wouldn't be sort of saying people are scaremongering, and that's for sure. If there are any of those sort of people watching this, and there will be, um, they're going to be saying, well, how the hell, do I know that something is going to happen? Well, firstly, I don't know. And I have never said I do or did. So just get that thought out of your heads, guys. I've never ever said that. I've always tried to choose my words sort of carefully. But what I do know is this. Firstly, some common sense. I do not suffer from normality bias. I apply logic based on facts and data. I have history to support that. It's happened before, so it supports the case that it could happen again. Okay, that's just logic. I've also lived in the real world, whereas many others haven't. Um, If you travel to many parts of Europe today, you'll see military assets and postures preparing for war. Many governments are telling their people to prepare for war. Many politicians, prime ministers, and presidents are threatening all out war. And some are mentioning the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and the fucking list goes on. So, for anyone to be accusing others of scaremongering, clearly have their own internal problems sort of going on in their own heads. My advice to those people is to pull your heads out of your backsides or just pull those bubbles off your heads and just wake up. Okay. I'm not doing this to insult anybody or be horrible or whatever it is. I'm just saying that this is a possibility. And if this possibility of an SHTF is on a scale that it could very well be, honestly, guys, so many of you are just going to get done. And that is it. I try my best to analyze the facts. I filter out the crap. Then I just sort of data crunch the rest by verifying the data. And from my findings, I'll just make a personal assumption on what I see based on those facts, not fiction. Now, if somebody sort of presents facts, then, that cannot be scaremongering. If the data is correct, it's just merely pointing out facts. However, if I or anyone else was sat there, sort of saying, yeah, World War III is happening, it's coming, there's going to be nukes flying all over the place and we're all going to die, then that's scaremongering. Okay, that's clearly scaremongering. If I or anyone else points out to you that Russia have deployed nuclear assets and weapons along its border and into allied countries, and the government of Belarus have announced that it is preparing for World War uh, not World War III, I'm not going to say that, with war with Europe, or various countries across Europe have physically deployed or presented on a website information booklets for its population, telling them how to prepare for war, or the list goes on. Then those, ladies and gents, are facts. These are things that are happening. Okay, if you don't believe me, just get out there and have a look. And I don't mean get out there and have a look at misinformation. Get out there onto the government websites and have a look. Of course, I know they talk a load of shit, but they're drip feeding us. Okay, they're drip feeding us, and just they're because when the shit hits the fan, or if it does, then at least they'll turn around and say, "Well, we told you so." Okay, and that's just how it'll be. We're nearly done. Just one more minute. Okay. I think that for those out there that are accusing others of scaremongering are actually sort of scared themselves. To use scaremongering as a suggestion is a defense mechanism, but a defense from what? I'd have to be asking myself that question. Being scared, probably. And do you know what, guys? There's absolutely nothing wrong with being scared, because if the shit hits the fan and there are nukes involved, you will be scared, I will be, and everyone else around you will be. So if you find yourselves thinking or not believing that anything catastrophic could happen and turn your worlds upside down, then let's just hope that it doesn't and everything's going to be fine. But just bear this one thought in your mind. If it does come knocking on your door and you're in no way, shape, or form prepared, even mentally, then that, my friend, will find, well, you'll find yourselves in a very dark place, a very dark and horrible place. That's all I can say. Okay. If everyone in this country were able to sort of sit there at home and say to themselves, the war and conflict happening around the world could, in capital letters, be a threat to me and my family, then you're halfway there, guys. By just acknowledging the fact that there is a possible threat. If you choose not to do anything about it, then at least you've only got yourselves to blame, and it will be easier for you to accept your fate. To that end, that's enough from me. I suggest that you get yourselves military fit and infantry wear, or get yourselves fit and healthy and adequately prepared.